When George Miller found the diamond wedding ring sparkling under the fluorescent lights of Meridian Tower's executive bathroom at 2:47 a.m., he had no idea that his decision to refuse the reward would expose a secret that would shake the foundations of one of Seattle's most powerful families. What started as a simple act of integrity would reveal a web of lies, forgotten promises, and a love story that had been buried for 20 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The janitor's cart squeaked softly as George pushed it down the marble hallway of the 42nd floor, the sound echoing through the empty corridors of Meridian Enterprises. At 53, George had been cleaning these offices for 8 years, invisible to the executives who worked here during the day. His weathered hands, scarred from years of manual labor, gripped the cart handle as he made his nightly rounds through the glass towers that stretched toward the Seattle skyline. Tonight felt different, though George couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the weight of the eviction notice folded in his back pocket, or the knowledge that his 15-year-old daughter Emma needed new school supplies he couldn't afford. Perhaps it was the ache in his lower back that reminded him he wasn't getting any younger, or the constant worry about making ends meet on a janitor's salary while raising a teenage daughter alone. The executive bathroom on the 42nd floor was always his last stop before moving to the lower levels. As CEO of Meridian Enterprises, Victoria Ashworth commanded the entire floor, her corner office overlooking Elliott Bay. George had seen her exactly 3 times in 8 years, always rushing past in designer heels, phone pressed to her ear, treating him like part of the furniture. He pushed open the bathroom door and began his routine, emptying trash, cleaning mirrors, mopping floors. That's when he saw it, a flash of brilliance near the marble sink that made him stop mid-motion. There, somehow wedged between the counter and the wall, was the most beautiful ring George had ever seen. The diamond was massive, at least 3 carats, surrounded by smaller stones that caught the light like tiny stars. The platinum band was engraved with delicate script that read, "Forever yours, M." George carefully picked it up, his calloused fingers gentle against the precious metal. He'd seen enough jewelry stores from the outside to know this ring was worth more than he made in 2 years, maybe 3. His first instinct was to turn it in to building security immediately, but something made him pause. The ring felt warm in his palm, and for a moment he thought about what that money could mean. Emma's college fund that he'd never been able to start, the dental work she needed that he'd been putting off, the car repairs that would keep his 20-year-old Honda running for another few months. George closed his eyes and saw Emma's face when he'd had to tell her they couldn't afford the art camp she desperately wanted to attend. He remembered the way she'd smiled and said it was okay, even though he could see the disappointment in her eyes. His daughter had never complained, not once, about their tiny apartment, their secondhand clothes, or the fact that they sometimes had cereal for dinner when money was tight. For exactly 30 seconds, George Miller allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to slip that ring into his pocket and walk away. Who would ever know? The building had hundreds of employees. Anyone could have found it. Anyone could have taken it. But then he thought about the person who had lost it. Someone was probably panicking right now, retracing their steps, desperately searching for this symbol of their love. George knew what it felt like to lose something precious. He'd lost his wife Sarah to cancer when Emma was just 5, and he still wore his simple wedding band even though it had been 10 years since she passed. George walked to the security desk in the lobby, the ring secure in a small envelope he'd found in the cleaning supplies. The night security guard, Marcus Thompson, looked up from his crossword puzzle with surprise. "Hey George, what's got you down here so early? Usually don't see you till sunrise." "Found something on 42, George said, sliding the envelope across the desk. "Wedding ring. Looks expensive. Figured someone's probably going crazy looking for it." Marcus opened the envelope and whistled low. "Holy smokes, George. This thing's gotta be worth a fortune." "Where'd you find it?" "Executive bathroom. Just sitting there by the sink." "You know there's probably a reward for something like this, right? Rich folks don't just lose rings like this without making noise about it." George shrugged. "Just want to make sure it gets back to whoever lost it." "You're a good man, George Miller," Marcus said, logging the ring into his incident report. "I'll make sure Ms. Ashworth knows first thing in the morning. This has got to be hers. She's the only one with an office on that floor." George nodded and returned to his cart, but as he rode the elevator back up to continue his rounds, He couldn't shake the feeling that finding that ring was going to change everything. He didn't know about the frantic phone calls Victoria Ashworth had been making all evening, or about the private investigator she'd already hired to search her apartment and retrace her steps from the day before. He certainly didn't know that the ring he'd just turned in wasn't Victoria's wedding ring at all, but belonged to someone Victoria had been trying to forget for 20 years. Someone who had loved her before the money, before the power, before she became the cold, calculating CEO that Seattle's business world both feared and respected. As George pushed his cart toward the stairwell, he thought about Emma sleeping peacefully in their small apartment, probably dreaming about the art scholarship she'd been working toward. He thought about the bills stacked on their kitchen table and the eviction notice that gave them 30 days to come up with rent money they didn't have. But mostly he thought about the relief on someone's face when they got their ring back, and how that feeling was worth more than any reward money could ever be. George Miller had no idea that his act of honesty was about to unlock secrets that had been buried in the highest levels of Meridian Enterprises, or that the woman who lost that ring had been searching for it and the love it represented for most of her adult life. What he also couldn't have imagined was that by morning his simple decision to do the right thing would put him in the center of a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about integrity, sacrifice, and the true meaning of wealth. The security camera footage would show his face clearly as he turned in the ring, and Victoria Ashworth would soon learn the name of the man who had found her most precious secret and refused to profit from it. The truth was, George Miller was about to discover that sometimes the most valuable thing you can find isn't something you can hold in your hand, it's something you can hold in your heart. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The elevator doors opened at exactly 8:15 a.m. and Victoria Ashworth stepped out onto the 42nd floor with the kind of purposeful stride that made junior executives scatter. Her Louboutin heels clicked against the marble with military precision, her charcoal Armani suit immaculate despite the fact that she'd been awake all night making phone calls and turning her penthouse apartment upside down. Victoria had built Meridian Enterprises from a small tech startup into a billion-dollar empire through sheer force of will and an absolute refusal to show weakness. At 45, she was known throughout Seattle's business community as the Ice Queen, brilliant, ruthless, and completely untouchable. What they didn't know was that she'd spent the last 12 hours in a state of panic that would have shocked anyone who knew her reputation. Ms. Ashworth, her assistant Rachel, called out as Victoria strode past the reception area. "Security called about 20 minutes ago. They have something that belongs to you." Victoria stopped so abruptly that Rachel nearly collided with the stack of contracts she was carrying. "What kind of something?" "A ring, ma'am, found in the executive bathroom last night." For the first time in years, Victoria Ashworth felt her carefully constructed composure crack. She'd searched everywhere, her office, her car, her apartment, even the restaurant where she'd had dinner the night before. The ring couldn't be gone, not that ring. Not after everything. Who found it? Victoria's voice was sharper than usual, though Rachel didn't seem to notice. "One of the night janitors, I think. Security has the details." Victoria was already moving toward the elevator before Rachel finished speaking. The ride down to the security office felt like the longest 2 minutes of her life. She'd worn that ring on a chain around her neck for 20 years, hidden beneath her business suits and designer blouses. The one day she'd decided to try wearing it on her finger again, just for a few hours in the privacy of her own office, it had somehow slipped off. Marcus Thompson looked up from his desk as the elevator doors opened, and Victoria could see the small evidence bag on his desk from across the room. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached. "Ms. Ashworth, thank goodness, we have your ring. Beautiful piece. Someone must be missing it terribly." Victoria's hand trembled slightly as Marcus handed her the bag. Through the clear plastic she could see the diamond catching the fluorescent light, the familiar engraving on the band that had been burned into her memory for 2 decades. "Forever yours, Em." "Where exactly was it found?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Executive bathroom on your floor. Night janitor found it around 3 a.m., brought it down immediately. Good man, that George Miller. Been working here 8 years, never had a single issue. Honest as they come." George Miller. Victoria repeated the name slowly. She'd never bothered to learn the names of the cleaning staff, had barely noticed their existence. "I'd like to thank him personally. Is he still here?" Marcus checked his watch. Shift ended at 6 a.m., but he'll be back tonight. Starts at 10 p.m. usually. You know, Ms. Ashworth, a lot of folks would have expected a reward for something like this. Ring's got to be worth more than most people see in a year. But George didn't even ask about it. Just wanted to make sure it got back to whoever lost it. Victoria nodded absently, her mind already racing. She needed to know more about this George Miller. In her world, everyone had an angle. Everyone wanted something. The idea that someone would find something so valuable and simply turn it in without expecting anything in return seemed impossible. "I'll be back tonight," she said, slipping the evidence bag into her purse. "Please don't mention to anyone that this ring was found. I'd prefer to keep it private." "Of course, ma'am. Company policy on lost items is strictly confidential anyway." Back in her office, Victoria sat behind her massive mahogany desk and stared at the ring she'd carefully removed from the evidence bag. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to breathe. The ring was safe. The secret it represented was still hers to keep. But the relief was quickly replaced by curiosity about the man who'd found it. Victoria pulled up the employee database on her computer and typed in George Miller. The photo that appeared showed a man with kind eyes and graying hair, wearing the standard blue uniform of the maintenance staff. According to his file, he was 53, had worked for the company for 8 years with perfect attendance, and lived in an apartment in Belltown with his 15-year-old daughter. Single father. Victoria studied the photo more closely, trying to understand what kind of man would find a fortune and simply walk away. In her experience, everyone had a price. Everyone could be bought or motivated by something. She'd built her entire business philosophy on that principle. Her phone buzzed with a text from her private investigator. "Found nothing at the restaurant or in your car. Are you certain you had it yesterday?" Victoria deleted the message without responding. She'd already called off the search, canceled the insurance claim she'd been preparing to file. But she couldn't stop thinking about George Miller and his decision to turn in the ring without asking for anything in return. That evening, Victoria did something she'd never done in 8 years of running Meridian Enterprises. Instead of leaving the building at her usual 7 p.m., she stayed late, waiting. At 9:45 p.m., she positioned herself near the service elevator, watching the employee entrance through the security monitors at the reception desk. At exactly 10:03 p.m., she saw him. George Miller pushed through the employee entrance carrying a worn backpack and a coffee mug with "World's Best Dad" printed on the side. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew his routine by heart, someone who took pride in his work even when no one was watching. Victoria made a decision that surprised even her. She walked to the service elevator and pressed the call button, timing it perfectly so that when George arrived with his cleaning cart, the doors would open for both of them. "Good evening," she said as they stepped into the elevator together. George looked genuinely startled to see her. "Oh, good evening, Ms. Ashworth. Working late tonight?" Something like that. Victoria studied his face, looking for any sign of recognition, any hint that he knew who she really was beyond just his boss. "I understand you found something of mine last night." George's expression remained neutral, professional. "Just doing my job, ma'am. Glad it made it back to you." Most people would have expected some kind of reward for returning something so valuable. George shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the handle of his cart. "Wasn't mine to keep." The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor, and George gestured for her to exit first. But Victoria didn't move. Something about his simple, honest response had caught her off guard. In her world of complex negotiations and hidden motivations, his straightforward integrity felt almost foreign. "Mr. Miller," she said, "would you mind if I asked you something?" George looked puzzled but nodded. "Of course." "Why didn't you keep it? Or at least ask about a reward? No one would have known." George was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria could see him choosing his words carefully. Finally, he said, "My daughter's always watching, even when she's not around. I want her to be proud of the man she calls Dad. Can't do that if I'm the kind of person who takes things that don't belong to me." The elevator doors started to close, and George quickly pressed the button to hold them open. "Your floor, Ms. Ashworth." Victoria stepped out into the hallway but turned back before the doors could close. "Thank you, Mr. Miller, for your honesty." "Just doing what's right, ma'am." As the elevator doors closed and carried George up to begin his cleaning rounds, Victoria stood alone in the marble hallway, staring at her reflection in the polished walls. For the first time in 20 years, she found herself thinking about what it meant to be the kind of person someone could be proud of. She had no idea that her brief conversation with George Miller had just set in motion a chain of events that would force her to confront the choices she'd made, the love she'd lost, and the woman she'd become in her relentless pursuit of success. All because of a ring, an honest janitor, and a 15-year-old girl who was always watching. Victoria couldn't sleep. She'd returned to her penthouse overlooking Puget Sound, poured herself a glass of 20-year-old Macallan, and tried to focus on the quarterly reports spread across her dining table. But George Miller's words kept echoing in her mind. "My daughter's always watching, even when she's not around." At 2 a.m., she found herself standing in front of her walk-in closet, staring at a small wooden box hidden behind her designer shoes. Inside was a collection of items she hadn't looked at in years. Ticket stubs from a Mariners game, a pressed flower from Pike Place Market, and a photo of herself at 25, laughing beside a young man with kind eyes and calloused hands. The man who had given her the ring. Michael Harrison, the construction worker who had loved her before she became Victoria Ashworth, back when she was just Vicky Chen, a struggling business student working 3 jobs to pay for college. The man whose proposal she'd accepted with tears of joy, only to break his heart 6 months later when she realized that marrying him would mean giving up her dreams of building an empire. She'd kept the ring all these years, unable to throw it away but too proud to return it. It was a reminder of the last time someone had loved her for who she was, not what she could do for them. The next morning, Victoria made a decision that shocked her entire executive team. She cleared her schedule for the day, something she hadn't done in 5 years, and drove to Belltown Elementary School. According to George's employee file, his daughter Emma was 15, which meant high school, but Victoria had learned long ago that information was power, and she needed to understand what kind of man had found her most precious secret. She sat in her Tesla across from Roosevelt High School, watching teenagers pour out of the building at 3:15 p.m. She almost missed Emma Miller entirely, a slight girl with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing jeans that had been carefully mended at the knee and carrying a backpack that had seen better days. What caught Victoria's attention was the way Emma stopped to help a younger student who had dropped his books, the genuine smile she offered, the way she reminded Victoria of someone who had been lost long ago. Victoria followed at a distance as Emma walked to a small coffee shop called The Grind, where she apparently had an after-school job. Through the window, Victoria watched the girl work, taking orders, cleaning tables, chatting easily with customers who clearly knew her by name. There was something about Emma's manner, her easy kindness with strangers, that made Victoria think of her father's quiet integrity. When Emma's shift ended at 6 p.m., Victoria made another impulsive decision. She entered the coffee shop just as Emma was hanging up her apron. "Excuse me," Victoria said, approaching the counter. "Are you Emma Miller?" Emma looked surprised but smiled politely. "Yes, ma'am. Can I help you with something?" "My name is Victoria Ashworth. I work with your father at Meridian Enterprises." Emma's face brightened immediately. "Oh, you're his boss." "Dad's always talking about how hard everyone works at that building. He's really proud to be part of the team there." Victoria felt something twist in her chest. George was proud to be a janitor at her company. When was the last time she'd felt proud of anything beyond a profitable quarter or a successful acquisition? "Your father did something very kind for me recently," Victoria said carefully. "He found something I'd lost, something very important to me." "That sounds like Dad," Emma said with obvious affection. "He's always finding lost things and making sure they get back to their owners. Last week, he found someone's wallet in the parking lot and spent his lunch break tracking down the owner." Victoria studied the girl more closely. Emma had her father's honest eyes, but there was something else there, a brightness, an intelligence that reminded Victoria of herself at that age. "What are your plans after high school, Emma?" "College, hopefully. I want to study art therapy, help kids who are going through tough times." Emma's smile faltered slightly. "I mean, if we can figure out the money part. Dad's been saving, but it's hard, you know." Victoria knew. She remembered working 3 jobs, eating ramen noodles for weeks at a time, wearing the same interview outfit until it was threadbare. She remembered the scholarship application essays she'd written and rewritten, begging strangers to invest in her potential. Has your father ever mentioned wanting anything different? A better job, perhaps? Emma looked confused by the question. Dad loves his work. He says every job has dignity if you do it with integrity. He's taught me that success isn't about what you have, it's about who you choose to be. She paused, then added with a shy smile, though I think he'd love to take me to see the art museums in Paris someday. He's always talking about how amazing that would be. Victoria felt something crack inside her chest. Here was a 15-year-old girl who worked after school to help with family expenses, who dreamed of helping other children, whose father had found a fortune and walked away from it without a second thought. And all Emma wanted was to see art in Paris with her dad. Emma, Victoria said slowly, what would you say if I told you I wanted to do something special for your father, to thank him for his kindness? I'd say Dad probably wouldn't accept it, Emma replied honestly. He doesn't like charity, says we make our own way in the world. What if it wasn't charity? What if it was an opportunity? Emma tilted her head, studying Victoria with those intelligent eyes. What kind of opportunity? Victoria made a decision that would change everything. What if I told you that your father's honesty and integrity are exactly the qualities I need for a special position at Meridian Enterprises? Something that would use his natural abilities and provide better opportunities for your family? I'd say you'd have to convince him, Emma said with a laugh. Dad's pretty set in his ways. But she hesitated, then continued quietly. He's been worried lately. About money, about my future. He tries to hide it, but I can tell. If you really have something that could help, something legitimate that he'd earned, I think he'd listen. That evening, Victoria returned to Meridian Tower at 10 p.m. She'd spent the afternoon researching every aspect of George Miller's life, his work history, his late wife's medical bills, his financial situation. What she'd found was a man who had worked 3 jobs while his wife battled cancer, who had never missed a child support payment even when it meant living on rice and beans, who had turned down overtime opportunities because they conflicted with Emma's school events. She found George on the 38th floor, methodically cleaning conference rooms with the same care and attention he'd shown every night for 8 years. When he saw her approaching, he stopped working and stood respectfully. Ms. Ashworth, working late again? Mr. Miller, I have a proposition for you. George's expression became guarded. Ma'am? I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about integrity, about doing what's right. Victoria paused, choosing her words carefully. I have a position opening up in my company, head of facilities management. It would involve overseeing all building operations, managing vendor relationships, ensuring everything runs smoothly. The salary would be substantial. George's eyebrows rose. I'm not sure I understand. In 8 years, this building has never run more efficiently than it does under the current night crew. You know every system, every vendor, every potential problem before it happens. You've been doing management work already. You just haven't been paid for it. Ms. Ashworth, I appreciate the thought, but the position comes with full benefits, including a college fund contribution for Emma, and an apartment in the company housing complex downtown, closer to her school, closer to opportunities. George was quiet for a long moment, his hands gripping his cleaning cloth. Why, he asked finally, why would you offer this to someone like me? Victoria looked at this man who had found her deepest secret and protected it without asking for anything in return. She thought about Emma's bright smile, her dreams of helping other children, her simple wish to see art in Paris with her father. She thought about the girl she used to be, and the woman she'd become, and the space between them that seemed impossible to bridge. Because, she said quietly, I've spent 20 years building a company full of people who know the price of everything and the value of nothing. I need someone who understands that some things are more important than money. Someone who would find a fortune and walk away from it because his daughter is always watching. George stared at her for a long moment, and Victoria could see him processing not just the offer, but everything behind it. This isn't charity. It's business. I need someone I can trust completely, someone whose integrity is absolute. You've already proven that you're that person. And if I say no? Then you continue doing exactly what you're doing, and I respect your decision completely. But George, Victoria paused, using his first name for the first time. Emma deserves every opportunity in the world, and so do you. George was quiet for so long that Victoria began to think he would refuse. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I'll need to think about it. Talk to Emma." "Of course. Take all the time you need." As Victoria walked back to the elevator, she realized she'd just made an offer that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with a 15-year-old girl's dreams and a father's quiet dignity. For the first time in 20 years, she'd made a decision based not on profit margins or strategic advantage, but on something far more valuable: the recognition that integrity was the rarest commodity in her world. What she didn't know was that her offer would set in motion events that would force both her and George to confront the true cost of their choices and the price of the lives they'd built in the shadow of their deepest fears. 2 weeks later, George Miller stood in the elevator that had once carried his cleaning cart, now wearing a navy blue suit that Emma had helped him pick out from the discount rack at Nordstrom Rack. His hands, scrubbed clean but still bearing the calluses of decades of manual labor, gripped a leather briefcase that felt foreign in his grasp. The elevator climbed past floors he'd once cleaned in the quiet hours of the night, now carrying him to an office on the 35th floor with his name on the door. "Head of Facilities Management," he whispered to himself, still unable to believe the words were real. The decision hadn't been easy. George had spent 3 sleepless nights walking the streets of Belltown, wrestling with whether accepting Victoria's offer was the right thing to do. It was Emma who had finally convinced him, not with arguments about money or opportunity, but with a simple observation that cut straight to his heart. "Dad," she'd said over their usual dinner of spaghetti and store-brand sauce, "you've spent your whole life making sure I could be proud of you. Maybe it's time you did something that would make you proud of yourself." Now, as the elevator doors opened onto the 35th floor, George stepped into a world that might as well have been another planet. The executive floors hummed with a different energy than the quiet halls he'd cleaned for 8 years. Phones rang constantly, assistants hurried past with urgent expressions, and everyone seemed to move with the purposeful intensity of people who dealt in millions rather than mop buckets. "Mr. Miller," a cheerful voice called out as George emerged from the elevator. A young woman with bright red hair and a tablet clutched to her chest approached him with a smile. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, your administrative assistant. Ms. Ashworth asked me to help you get settled today." Assistant? George almost laughed at the absurdity of it. 3 weeks ago, he'd been invisible to everyone in this building except the security guards. Now he had an assistant whose job was to help him navigate a world he'd never imagined being part of. "Thank you, Jennifer," he said, proud that his voice remained steady. "I appreciate any help you can give me." Jennifer led him down a hallway lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering spectacular views of Elliott Bay. She chattered easily about his schedule, the department he'd be managing, and the various systems he'd need to learn. George nodded and tried to absorb the information, but part of his mind was still stuck on the impossibility of his situation. His office was modest by executive standards, but luxurious beyond anything George had ever imagined for himself. A solid oak desk dominated the space, flanked by matching bookshelves and a small conference table. The window behind his desk offered a view of the Sound that he'd only ever seen from the lobby level during his brief breaks. "Your first meeting is at 10 a.m., Jennifer explained, placing a stack of folders on his desk. Department heads from maintenance, security, and vendor relations. They're all eager to meet their new supervisor." George opened the top folder and found himself looking at organizational charts, budget reports, and vendor contracts worth more money than he'd ever imagined. His chest tightened with the familiar anxiety he'd been fighting since accepting the position. What if he couldn't do this? What if Victoria had made a mistake in trusting him with so much responsibility? "Mr. Miller?" Jennifer's voice was gentle. "Are you okay?" George looked up to find her watching him with concern. "Just taking it all in. This is quite a change from my previous position." "Ms. Ashworth mentioned you'd been with the night maintenance crew. That's actually perfect. You know the building systems better than anyone." The previous facilities manager never even walked the floors. He managed everything from spreadsheets and never understood what the actual work required. Before George could respond, there was a knock on his door frame. Victoria Ashworth stood in the doorway, looking impeccable as always in a charcoal gray suit. But George noticed something different in her expression, a nervousness that seemed out of character for the woman who commanded corporate boardrooms. "Good morning, George. How are you settling in?" Still figuring out which end is up, George admitted honestly, but Jennifer's been very helpful. Victoria nodded to Jennifer, who took the hint and left them alone. Victoria closed the door and moved to the window, her back to George as she spoke. I want you to know that this isn't charity or some elaborate gesture of gratitude. The budget reports in those folders will show you exactly how much inefficiency was costing us under the previous management. You're not here because I feel sorry for you. You're here because you're the right person for the job. George studied her profile against the window. Then why do you look like you're having second thoughts? Victoria turned, surprise flickering across her features. Most people were too intimidated by her position to be so direct. Because I'm asking you to change your entire life based on my judgment. What if I'm wrong? What if this world destroys the very qualities that made me want to hire you in the first place? The vulnerability in her voice caught George off guard. This wasn't the ice-cold CEO he'd met in the elevator. This was someone who understood the weight of the decision she'd placed on his shoulders. Ms. Ashworth, George said slowly, I've been thinking about why you really offered me this job. It wasn't just about the ring, was it? Victoria was quiet for a long moment. What do you think it was about? I think you're looking for something you lost a long time ago. Something that money and power couldn't buy back. George leaned forward in his chair. I don't know what that is, but I know what it feels like to lose something precious. And I know that sometimes we make choices that seem right at the time, but leave us wondering who we might have been if we'd chosen differently. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. You're very perceptive for she stopped herself. For a janitor? George finished with a slight smile. I've had 8 years to observe this place, Ms. Ashworth. I've seen how people behave when they think no one's watching. I've seen who stays late to finish someone else's work, who treats the cleaning staff with respect, who throws tantrums when things don't go their way. You learn a lot about people when you're invisible. And what did you learn about me? George considered his words carefully. I learned that you work later than anyone else in the building, that you never leave a mess for others to clean up, that you say please and thank you to people even when you don't think they can hear you, that you keep a picture of a young couple on your desk that you turn face down when you have meetings. Victoria's breath caught. She'd forgotten about that photo, hidden in plain sight on her desk for years, a reminder of who she used to be. I also learned, George continued, that success without happiness is just expensive misery. And I think maybe that's why you offered me this job. Not because you needed a facilities manager, but because you needed to remember what it looks like when someone chooses integrity over opportunity. Except you didn't choose integrity over opportunity, Victoria pointed out. You're here. No, George said quietly. I chose integrity with opportunity. You gave me a chance to provide for my daughter without compromising who I am. That's a gift I'll never be able to repay. Victoria walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. George, that young couple in the photo, they were engaged once. He was a good man. Honest, hard-working, kind. She left him because she thought love wasn't enough to build a life on. Was she right? Victoria's smile was sad. I guess we'll find out. Your first meeting starts in 10 minutes. Try not to let them intimidate you. Most of them have never done an honest day's work in their lives. As the door closed behind her, George sat alone in his new office, understanding for the first time that his promotion was about more than facilities management. He was Victoria's experiment in redemption, her test to see if integrity could survive in a world built on compromise. What he didn't know was that across town, a construction foreman named Michael Harrison was reading a newspaper article about Meridian Enterprises, new facilities manager. A former janitor whose promotion was being hailed as an innovative approach to corporate leadership. The article included a photo of the company's CEO, and Michael Harrison's coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering on the construction trailer floor. After 20 years, he'd found her again. The third week of George's new position brought his first real test. A water main break on the 22nd floor at 6 a.m. flooded 3 conference rooms and threatened to shut down operations for the entire east wing of Meridian Tower. George arrived at the scene to find chaos. Executives standing in ankle-deep water, IT staff frantically moving servers, and the previous facilities management team's emergency protocols proving completely inadequate. Where's the water shut-off? Demanded Patricia Blackwood, Meridian's chief operating officer, her usually immaculate Prada pumps ruined by the murky water. This is costing us thousands every minute we're down. George had worked these floors for 8 years. He knew every pipe, every valve, every emergency system in the building. While Patricia's team scrambled with building schematics, George was already wading through the water toward a maintenance panel hidden behind a decorative wall covering that most people never noticed. "The main shutoff is 3 floors down," he called out, his voice calm despite the crisis. "But there's an isolation valve right here that'll stop the flow to this section." Within minutes, the water stopped rising, and George was coordinating with the emergency response team he'd worked alongside for years, not as their supervisor, but as their colleague. "How did you know about that valve?" Patricia asked, watching George direct the cleanup with quiet efficiency. "Same way I know that the backup generator on the 31st floor has been making a grinding noise for 6 months, or that the HVAC system in the North Conference Room shuts down every Tuesday at 2 p.m., George replied, not looking up from his coordination with the water damage crew. "I've been listening to this building for 8 years. What George didn't see was the small crowd of executives who had gathered to watch him work. What he also didn't notice was Victoria Ashworth standing at the back of the group, observing how naturally he commanded respect from people who had previously treated him as invisible. But not everyone was impressed by George's performance. Later that afternoon, as George reviewed the incident reports in his office, he overheard a conversation in the hallway that made his stomach clench. "I don't care how well he handled the flood," came the voice of Richard Sterling, Meridian's vice president of operations. "Ashworth's lost her mind, promoting the janitor to facilities management. It's embarrassing. What are our clients going to think when they find out we're being run by the help?" "Keep your voice down," hissed another voice George recognized as David Chen from Human Resources. "But you're right. This is some kind of charity case gone wrong. The man doesn't even have a college degree. How's he supposed to manage million-dollar vendor contracts?" "He's going to crash and burn," Richard continued. "And when he does, it'll reflect poorly on all of us. We need to document every mistake, every sign that he's in over his head, for the good of the company." George sat frozen at his desk, the incident reports forgotten. He'd known this would happen, had expected it even. But hearing it spoken aloud, the casual dismissal of his worth, the assumption that he was destined to fail, hit harder than he'd anticipated. The next morning brought a new challenge. George arrived at his office to find a stack of vendor contracts on his desk that needed immediate review. The numbers were staggering, a single maintenance contract worth more than he'd made in his entire lifetime. As he struggled through the legal language and technical specifications, Jennifer appeared in his doorway with a concerned expression. "Mr. Miller?" Mr. Sterling called. "He wants to see you in his office about the Hartwell Industries contract." George's heart sank. Richard Sterling had been the previous facilities manager's closest ally, and George suspected this meeting was designed to expose his inexperience. He gathered the contract files and made his way to Sterling's corner office, steel gray and imposing, with awards and diplomas covering every wall. "George," Sterling said without looking up from his computer, his tone dripping with false familiarity, "I've been reviewing your work on the Hartwell contract. Some concerns have come up." "What kind of concerns?" George asked, settling into the uncomfortable chair across from Sterling's massive desk. "Well, for starters, you approved their bid without negotiating the service response times. That's going to cost us significantly if we have emergency repairs." Sterling leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression. "Also, you didn't catch the clause about overtime charges for weekend work." "That's basic contract management, George." George felt heat rise in his chest. He'd spent 2 days studying that contract, cross-referencing every detail with the building's actual needs. "With respect, Mr. Sterling, Hartwell's response times are already 30% faster than our current vendor, and their weekend rates are still 15% lower than the industry standard. The contract saves us money while improving service." Sterling's expression hardened. "That's not the point. The point is process, George. This is about understanding the complexities of corporate negotiations, not just comparing numbers like you're shopping for cleaning supplies." The dismissive tone, the implication that George was too simple to understand real business, triggered something protective and fierce in George's chest. He thought about Emma, working after school to help with expenses while dreaming of college. He thought about 8 years of being invisible, of listening to these same executives waste money on consultants who charged thousands to tell them things their own maintenance staff already knew. "Mr. Sterling," George said quietly, "I may not have an MBA, but I know the difference between what works and what looks impressive on paper." Hartwell Industries built this building's HVAC system 12 years ago. Their technicians know every component, every quirk, every potential failure point. The previous vendor charged us premium rates to bring in outside contractors who had to learn our systems from scratch every time something broke. That's exactly my point, Sterling interrupted. You're thinking like maintenance staff, not like a manager. This position requires strategic thinking, not just technical knowledge. George stood up, gathering his contract files. Mr. Sterling, in 8 years of working nights, I've seen million-dollar decisions made by people who never set foot on the floors where the work actually happens. I've watched consultants get paid more in a month than most of our maintenance staff make in a year, just to recommend changes that any technician could have told you wouldn't work. Strategic thinking that ignores practical reality isn't strategic. It's expensive. As George reached the door, Sterling's voice followed him. You know, George, Ms. Ashworth may have given you this position, but she won't be able to protect you if you can't prove you belong here. This isn't the night shift anymore. The rules are different at this level. George paused with his hand on the door handle. You're right, Mr. Sterling, the rules are different. The question is whether those rules exist to make the company better or just to make sure certain people stay in their place. That evening, George sat in his small apartment kitchen helping Emma with her calculus homework while nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The stress of the day weighed on him. Sterling's condescension, the whispered conversations in hallways, the constant feeling that he was one mistake away from proving his critics right. Dad, Emma looked up from her textbook. You seem upset. Bad day at the new job? George managed to smile. Just some workplace politics. Nothing I can't handle. Is it because you used to be a janitor? Emma asked with the direct honesty that only teenagers possessed. Are people being weird about that? George sighed. Some people think that where you start determines where you belong. They can't imagine that someone who cleaned floors might actually understand how to run a building. Emma was quiet for a moment, her pencil tapping against her notebook. Remember when Mom was sick? And that one doctor kept talking to you like you were stupid because you didn't use the right medical terms? But you knew more about her condition than anyone because you'd been there for every appointment, every treatment, every bad night? George nodded, remembering Dr. Harrison's patronizing tone, the way he'd dismissed George's observations about Sarah's symptoms until the test results proved George had been right all along. This is the same thing, Emma said simply. They're so busy looking at your resume that they can't see what you actually know. But you don't have to prove anything to them, Dad. You just have to do the job. As George helped Emma pack up her homework, he realized she was right. He'd been so focused on earning the respect of people like Sterling that he'd forgotten why Victoria had hired him in the first place. She hadn't chosen him despite his background. She'd chosen him because of it. What George didn't know was that 20 floors above, Victoria was working late again, reviewing reports that showed the building was running more efficiently than it had in years. What she also didn't know was that outside in the construction trailer across the street, Michael Harrison was finishing his shift and staring up at the lights in her office, working up the courage to finally make contact after 20 years of silence. The forces that would test both George's resolve and Victoria's carefully constructed world were already in motion, and tomorrow would bring challenges that would force them both to decide who they really were when everything they'd built was at stake. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon when George was reviewing maintenance schedules in the building's mechanical room, a place where few executives ever ventured. He'd been down here countless times during his janitorial years, but now he noticed something that had been bothering him for months, an unusual vibration in the main elevator shaft that occurred every day between 2 and 4 p.m. George was running diagnostics on the elevator control panel when he heard footsteps echoing in the mechanical corridor. He turned to see Victoria approaching, looking oddly out of place in her designer suit among the pipes and electrical panels. Jennifer said I might find you down here, Victoria said, stepping carefully around a puddle of condensation. I've been looking for you. Is there a problem? George asked, wiping his hands on a work towel. Despite his new position, he still carried the instincts of a maintenance worker, always ready to fix what was broken. Actually, yes, but not the kind you might think. Victoria moved closer, her expression troubled. I've been hearing rumors about resistance to your promotion. People questioning my judgment. George nodded slowly. Mr. Sterling's been pretty vocal about his concerns, but that's not your problem to solve. It is, though, Victoria said firmly, because if they undermine you, they undermine me, and more than that, she paused, seeming to struggle with her words. I need to know I made the right choice, not just for the company, but for you, for Emma. The vulnerability in her voice caught George off guard. This wasn't the ice-cold CEO giving orders. This was someone genuinely worried that she'd made a mistake that would hurt people she'd come to care about. Miss Ashworth, George said gently, can I ask you something personal? Victoria tensed slightly but nodded. That ring I found, it wasn't from your current marriage, was it? Victoria's composure cracked completely. She looked away, staring at the maze of pipes overhead. How did you know? The inscription, forever yours, Em, and the way you looked when you got it back, like someone who'd lost the last piece of something important. George leaned against the elevator control panel. Also, I've never seen you wear a wedding ring. Woman as successful as you, if she was happily married, that would be part of her armor. But you wear that ring on a chain around your neck, hidden under your clothes. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. His name was Michael Harrison. We were everything to each other. I was 25, working 3 jobs to get through business school. He was a construction worker, building the foundation for my dreams in more ways than one. What happened? I got accepted to a graduate program at Wharton, full scholarship, but it meant 2 years in Philadelphia, then probably New York for work. Michael proposed the night I got the acceptance letter. Victoria's voice grew soft with memory. He said we could make it work long distance, that love was more important than career plans. George waited, sensing there was more. I said no. I broke up with him 2 weeks later. Victoria's voice hardened. I told him I couldn't build the life I wanted while tied to someone who didn't understand ambition. I was cruel about it. I wanted to make sure he wouldn't wait for me. But you kept the ring. I kept the ring. Victoria touched her neck unconsciously, where the chain lay hidden beneath her blouse. For 20 years, I've told myself I made the right choice. Look what I built. Look what I accomplished. I convinced myself that love was a luxury I couldn't afford. George studied her face in the harsh fluorescent light of the mechanical room. And now? Now I'm 45 years old, and I'm standing in a basement talking to the only honest man I've met in 20 years, wondering if I built my empire on the ruins of my life. Victoria looked directly at him. That's why I hired you, George. Not just because you returned the ring, but because you reminded me that there are still people who choose integrity over advantage. I needed to know that kind of goodness could survive in my world. And what have you learned? Victoria smiled sadly. That goodness doesn't just survive. It transforms everything around it. In 6 weeks, you've changed how this building operates. Not just the systems and procedures, but how people treat each other. The maintenance staff respects you because you've been where they are. The vendors trust you because you understand their work. Even the executives who resent your promotion can't argue with your results. But I'm afraid I've put you in an impossible position. Sterling and his allies are looking for any excuse to get rid of you. They see you as a threat to their version of how business should work. George was quiet for a moment, listening to the steady hum of machinery around them. Ms. Ashworth, can I tell you something about the night shift? Victoria nodded. You see things differently when you work while everyone else sleeps. You see the building as it really is, not the polished version people present during business hours. You see which departments actually collaborate and which ones just pretend to. You see who takes credit for other people's work and who does the job without expecting recognition. What does that have to do with Sterling? Sterling's been here 15 years, and in all that time he's never once acknowledged the existence of the people who keep this building running. He doesn't know their names, doesn't understand their work, and he's never bothered to learn how the systems actually function. George looked directly at Victoria. You want to know why I'm not worried about his opinion? Because you can't tear down something that's built on a foundation you don't understand. Victoria stared at him. You really believe that? I know it, because I've been watching this place work from the bottom up for 8 years. Sterling sees hierarchies and org charts. I see the people who make everything happen. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the mechanical sounds of the building around them. Finally, Victoria spoke. "George, there's something else. Something I haven't told you about why I really offered you this position." "What's that?" "I've been thinking about selling the company." George's eyebrows shot up. "Selling Meridian?" "There's been an offer. A very good offer from a consortium that wants to break us up and sell the pieces. They've been pressuring me for months." Victoria's voice was weary. "I built this company to prove I could do anything, be anything. But lately, I wonder what the point was. What legacy am I leaving? A bunch of glass towers and profit margins. And hiring me fits into this how? Because I wanted to see if it was possible to run a business based on something other than fear and greed. If someone like you could succeed here, maybe there was hope for the culture I'd created." Victoria looked around the mechanical room. "This conversation we're having right now. When's the last time I talked to anyone about something that actually mattered? Not quarterly projections or market share, but what it means to choose between love and ambition, between who we are and who we think we need to be." George understood now. "You're testing whether your world can change or whether it'll always corrupt everything good that enters it." "And?" George smiled. "Ask me in 6 months. But I'll tell you this. Emma's been watching me navigate this new job, and every day I come home, still the same man who raised her. Your world hasn't changed me, Ms. Ashworth. Maybe I'm changing it." As they walked back toward the elevator, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not for profit margins or market dominance, but for the possibility that success and integrity weren't mutually exclusive. What neither of them knew was that 3 blocks away, Michael Harrison was sitting in his truck outside Emma's high school, watching her walk to her after-school job. He'd been trying to work up the courage to approach Victoria for weeks, but seeing George's daughter, this bright, kind young woman who carried herself with the same quiet dignity as her father, had given him an idea. Sometimes the best way to reach someone who had built walls around their heart was to find the one person they'd let inside. Emma Miller was walking home from her shift at the grind when she noticed the man in the construction truck. It was the 3rd time this week she'd seen him parked across from her school, and today he was sitting outside the coffee shop when her shift ended at 6 p.m. He wasn't threatening, middle-aged, weathered hands gripping a coffee cup, eyes that seemed sad rather than dangerous. But Emma had inherited her father's observational skills and her mother's protective instincts. When the man got out of his truck and approached her, Emma stopped walking and assessed her options. The coffee shop was still open behind her, and she knew the evening manager well enough to duck inside if needed. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice gentle but nervous. "Are you Emma Miller?" "Depends on who's asking," Emma replied, keeping her distance but not showing fear. Her father had taught her that confidence was often the best defense. "My name is Michael Harrison. I knew your father's boss a long time ago, Victoria Ashworth." The man's voice caught slightly on the name. "I was hoping maybe you could help me with something." Emma studied his face more carefully. There was something familiar about his eyes, something that reminded her of the old photographs her father kept in a shoebox. Pictures of people who had mattered once, before loss changed everything. "What kind of help?" she asked cautiously. Michael seemed to struggle with how to explain. "Victoria and we used to be very close, 20 years ago, but I made some mistakes, and she made some choices, and we lost touch. I've been trying to figure out how to reach out to her, but—" He gestured helplessly. "She's built quite a life for herself. I'm not sure someone like me belongs in her world anymore." Emma's expression softened slightly. She recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same expression her father had worn for months after her mother died, the look of someone who had lost something precious and didn't know how to find their way back to hope. "Mr. Harrison," she said carefully, "I don't really know Ms. Ashworth personally. My dad works for her, but they don't exactly move in the same social circles." "Actually, I think they might be closer than you realize," Michael said. "I've been reading about your father's promotion, about how Ms. Ashworth specifically chose him for this position. That's not the Victoria I knew 20 years ago. She didn't usually take chances on people unless they meant something to her." Emma tilted her head, processing this information. Her father had been oddly secretive about the details of his promotion, deflecting her questions about why Victoria Ashworth had chosen him specifically. "What exactly do you want from me?" "I want to write her a letter," Michael said simply, "but I don't know if she'd even read it if it came through normal channels." "I was hoping—" maybe your father could give it to her, person to person, so she'd know it was real, not some kind of business thing. Emma was quiet for a long moment, studying this man who claimed to have known Victoria Ashworth before she became the most powerful businesswoman in Seattle. What kind of mistakes did you make? Michael's laugh was rueful. I wasn't ambitious enough. Or maybe I was ambitious about the wrong things. I wanted to build a life with her, but she wanted to build an empire. When she chose the empire, I was too proud to fight for her, too stubborn to follow. I let her go because I thought that's what she wanted. And now? Now I'm 52 years old and I've spent 20 years building other people's dreams because I was too afraid to chase my own. I read about your father in the newspaper, how he found something valuable and returned it without expecting anything in return. How she promoted him not because of his credentials but because of his character. Michael looked directly at Emma. I think maybe she's looking for the same things I am. The things we both walked away from 20 years ago. Emma made a decision that would have surprised her father with its boldness. Mr. Harrison, would you like to get a cup of coffee? I get off work, but I think we should talk more about this. 20 minutes later, they sat across from each other in a corner booth at the grind, Emma nursing a hot chocolate, while Michael struggled with coffee that had gone cold. The evening shift was quiet, just a few students studying and a businessman typing furiously on his laptop. Tell me about her, Emma said. What was she like before she became this powerful CEO everyone's afraid of? Michael's expression brightened for the first time. She was brilliant, but not cold. Ambitious, but not ruthless. She used to laugh so hard at terrible jokes that she'd snort, and then get embarrassed about the snorting. He smiled at the memory. She worked 3 jobs to pay for school, but she'd still spend her last $5 on flowers for our tiny apartment because she said beauty was necessary, not optional. She sounds different from what I've heard about her now. Success changes people. Sometimes it hardens them, makes them forget who they were before they had to be strong all the time. Michael's voice grew sad. I think maybe that's what happened to both of us. We became the people we thought we needed to be, and forgot the people we actually were. Emma leaned forward. Mr. Harrison, can I ask you something? Why now? Why reach out after 20 years? Michael was quiet for a long moment. Because last month, I was working on a demolition project downtown. Old building, built in the 1950s. As we were tearing down the walls, we found a time capsule that some workers had hidden in 1952. Letters to their families, photos, little mementos. What did you do with it? We tracked down the families, returned everything we could. Watched people cry over letters their grandfathers had written, over pictures they thought were lost forever. Michael's voice grew thick with emotion, and I realized that some things are too important to stay buried, some connections are too precious to let pride or fear keep them locked away. Emma nodded slowly. And you think Victoria feels the same way? I think she spent 20 years being the person she thought she needed to be, just like I have. But when I read about your father, about how she chose integrity over credentials, character over connections, I think maybe she's ready to remember who she used to be. Emma pulled out her phone and typed a quick text to her father. Working late tonight. Don't wait up for dinner. Important conversation happening. Mr. Harrison, she said, putting her phone away, I'll help you. But not because I think you deserve it, and not because I know what's best for Ms. Ashworth. I'll help you because I've watched my dad for 15 years, and he's taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is give people a chance to surprise you. What do you want me to do? Write your letter, but don't just apologize for the past or explain your regrets. Tell her who you are now. Tell her what you've learned. Tell her what you want to build together, not what you wish you hadn't lost. Emma's voice was firm, wise beyond her years. And be prepared for the possibility that she might not be ready to hear it. 20 years is a long time to build walls around your heart. Michael nodded, understanding that this teenager was offering him something precious. Not just help in reaching Victoria, but wisdom about how to do it right. There's one more thing, Emma said as they prepared to leave. My dad's been different since he started working for her. Happier, but also more thoughtful. Like he's discovered something about himself he didn't know was there. I think maybe she has too. So whatever you write in that letter, remember that you're not just reaching out to the girl you knew 20 years ago, you're reaching out to the woman she's become. As Emma walked home that evening, she realized she'd just involved herself in a love story that had been 20 years in the making. What she didn't know was that her father and Victoria were, at that very moment, working late together in the Meridian building, reviewing budget proposals, and discovering that the professional partnership Victoria had created as an experiment was becoming something neither of them had expected, a friendship built on mutual respect and understanding. The letter Michael Harrison would write that night would set in motion events that would test not just Victoria's carefully constructed world, but George's growing confidence in his place within it. And at the center of it all would be a 15-year-old girl who had inherited her father's wisdom and her mother's courage, helping to bridge the gap between the past people thought they had to bury and the future they were finally brave enough to build. The letter arrived on Victoria's desk 3 days later, hand-delivered by George during their usual morning briefing. Victoria had grown to appreciate these meetings, 30 minutes where she could discuss real problems with someone who offered practical solutions instead of corporate jargon. Today, however, George seemed unusually nervous, fidgeting with a manila envelope as they reviewed the quarterly maintenance reports. "Ms. Ashworth," George said as they finished discussing the HVAC upgrades, "there's something else. Someone asked me to give this to you personally." He placed the envelope on her desk, his expression carefully neutral. "The person said it was important that you know it came from someone who respects your privacy." Victoria stared at the envelope, her name written in handwriting that made her heart skip several beats. After 20 years, she would have recognized Michael Harrison's writing anywhere. The careful print of someone who worked with his hands but took pride in clarity. "George," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off the envelope, "did you read this?" "No, ma'am, but—" George hesitated. "The person who asked me to deliver it seemed like someone who cared about you. Someone who'd been thinking about this for a long time." Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the envelope. "Thank you for bringing it to me." George nodded and left, closing the door behind him. Victoria sat alone in her office for 10 minutes before finding the courage to open the letter. When she finally unfolded the pages, Michael's words hit her like a physical blow. "Victoria, I don't know if you'll read this, or if you'll tear it up the moment you see my name. I wouldn't blame you either way. 20 years is a long time to carry regret, but not long enough to forget what it felt like to love someone completely. I've started this letter 100 times over the years, usually on your birthday, or the anniversary of the day I proposed, or Christmas mornings when I remembered how you used to insist on making pancakes shaped like snowflakes. But I always threw them away because I thought I'd lost the right to miss you when I let pride keep me from fighting for us. I know you chose your dreams over our life together. I know you believed you had to choose at all. For 20 years, I convinced myself you were wrong, that love should have been enough. But I understand now that I wasn't asking you to choose love over ambition. I was asking you to choose my version of happiness over your own. You were 25 years old with a chance to build something extraordinary, and I was too young and too proud to see that supporting your dreams might have meant stepping outside my comfort zone. I wanted you to fit into the life I could provide instead of finding ways to build the life you deserved. I've spent 20 years in construction, building other people's visions. Good work, honest work, but always someone else's blueprint. Last month, I found myself wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to help you build your dreams instead of asking you to abandon them for mine. I read about your success, about the company you built from nothing. I'm proud of you, even though I have no right to be. I'm also sorry it took me 20 years to understand that loving someone means wanting them to become who they're meant to be, even if that person grows beyond what you can imagine. I don't know what you want from life now, or if there's room in your world for someone like me, but I know what I want to tell you. You were right to choose your dreams. You were right to build something bigger than what we had, and if I could go back, I wouldn't ask you to stay. I'd ask you to let me come with you. I'm not writing this because I think we can go back to who we were. I'm writing because I finally understand who I want to become. And that journey started with loving you. If you're willing, I'd like to buy you coffee. Not to relitigate the past or make promises about the future, but just to see who we both became in these 20 years apart. The ring you wore around your neck, I know you kept it. Just like I kept the photo of us from Pike Place Market in my wallet, even through 2 relationships that ended, because I couldn't stop comparing them to a love I thought I'd lost forever. Maybe some things are too important to stay buried. Forever yours, if you'll have me, Michael. Victoria read the letter 3 times before the tears started, not the careful, controlled emotion she allowed herself in private, but the raw, overwhelming grief of 20 years of wondering, what if? She pressed the letter against her chest and remembered the last time Michael had held her, the night before she left for Philadelphia, when they'd both tried to pretend that love could survive anything. The phone on her desk buzzed, her assistant reminding her about the board meeting in 15 minutes. Victoria wiped her eyes, straightened her suit, and prepared to become the ice-cold CEO that Seattle's business community expected. But as she walked to the conference room, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that the life she'd built wasn't the only life she could choose. The board meeting was a disaster. Victoria, normally sharp and focused, found herself distracted and emotional. When Richard Sterling questioned the wisdom of promoting unqualified personnel to management positions, Victoria's response was sharper than usual. Mr. Sterling, in 3 months, George Miller has improved building efficiency by 23% and reduced vendor costs by 18%. What exactly do you consider qualification if not results? I'm talking about appropriate corporate hierarchy, Sterling replied smoothly. About maintaining professional standards. Professional standards, Victoria repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. You mean the standards that led the previous facilities manager to approve contracts with vendors who overcharged us for years? The standards that prioritize credentials over competence? The room grew uncomfortable. Board members exchanged glances, recognizing that their CEO was operating on a much shorter fuse than usual. Victoria, said Margaret Caldwell, the board's senior member, perhaps we should table this discussion until next month's meeting. Victoria nodded curtly and ended the meeting 20 minutes early. As the board members filed out, Sterling lingered. Victoria, I hope you know that my concerns about Miller come from a place of respect for this company. We can't afford to make decisions based on sentiment. Victoria looked at Sterling, really looked at him for the first time in years. She saw a man who had spent his entire career climbing corporate ladders without ever questioning what he was climbing toward. A man who measured success by the height of his office and the deference of his subordinates. Richard, she said slowly, when's the last time you made a decision that surprised you? When's the last time you chose something because it was right instead of because it was safe? Sterling looked genuinely confused by the question. I'm not sure I understand. I know, Victoria said sadly. That's the problem. That evening, Victoria found herself walking through Pike Place Market for the first time in years. She bought flowers, bright yellow tulips that served no corporate purpose, and sat on a bench overlooking Elliott Bay. The letter was in her purse, read so many times that the creases were becoming permanent. Her phone buzzed with texts from her assistant about tomorrow's schedule, emails from board members concerned about her behavior in the meeting, and a message from the consortium interested in buying Meridian Enterprises, increasing their offer by 10%. For the first time in 20 years, Victoria Ashworth didn't immediately respond to any of them. Instead, she sat watching the sunset over Puget Sound, holding flowers that would die in a week, and thinking about a man who had spent 20 years learning that love meant letting people become who they were meant to be. She thought about George Miller, who had returned a fortune because his daughter was always watching. She thought about Emma Miller, a teenager wise enough to understand that integrity was more valuable than opportunity. She thought about the woman she had been at 25, brave enough to dream bigger than anyone expected, and the woman she had become at 45, powerful enough to make any choice she wanted. And for the first time since she'd broken Michael Harrison's heart to chase her ambitions, Victoria wondered if it was possible to choose love without giving up everything she'd built. If it was possible to be powerful and vulnerable, successful and human, the CEO of a billion-dollar company, and the woman who used to make snowflake pancakes on Christmas morning. The answer, she realized, depended on whether she was brave enough to find out. The crisis began with a single phone call that George received at 5:47 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. Emma was getting ready for school when George's phone rang, the harsh tone cutting through their usual morning routine of coffee and last-minute homework checks. Mr. Miller, this is Detective Sarah Chen with Seattle PD. We need you to come down to the station. There's been an incident involving Meridian Enterprises. George's blood ran cold. What kind of incident? Is Ms. Ashworth okay? She's fine, sir, but there's been a break-in at the building, and some significant irregularities have come to light. Your access codes were used to enter restricted areas during non-business hours. We need to discuss your whereabouts last night. Dad? Emma looked up from her cereal, worry creasing her young face. What's wrong? George covered the phone. Nothing, sweetheart, just a work issue. I'll drive you to school and then handle this. But as George hung up the phone, he felt the familiar chill of being powerless in a system designed to protect those who already had everything. Someone had used his access codes. Someone who knew enough about his schedule and security clearances to frame him perfectly. At the police station, George sat across from Detective Chen in a sterile interview room that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. The detective was professional but thorough, laying out a timeline that made George's stomach sink with each revelation. According to security logs, your access code was used to enter the building at 11:43 p.m. last night. The executive-level safe was opened at 12:17 a.m., using codes that only facilities management would have access to. Detective, I was home with my daughter all evening. We watched a movie and went to bed around 10:30. Emma can confirm that. I'm sure she can, Detective Chen said gently, but teenagers aren't always reliable witnesses when it comes to protecting their parents. And access codes can be shared or stolen. George felt the weight of suspicion settling around him like a familiar coat. What was taken? That's the interesting part. Nothing was actually stolen. But several confidential documents were photographed, including merger discussions and financial projections. Industrial espionage rather than theft. And you think I would risk my job, my daughter's future, to take pictures of documents I wouldn't even understand? Detective Chen leaned forward. Mr. Miller, your promotion from janitor to facilities manager raised some eyebrows in the building. Some people think it was unusual. There's been speculation about what kind of relationship you might have with Ms. Ashworth. The implication hit George like a physical blow. You think I was sleeping with her for information? I think someone wants us to think that. The question is who and why. 3 hours later, George sat in Victoria's office, both of them staring at the termination paperwork that Richard Sterling had prepared with remarkable speed. Sterling sat across from Victoria's desk, wearing the satisfied expression of a man whose patience had finally been rewarded. I'm sorry, Victoria, but we can't afford even the appearance of impropriety, Sterling said, not sounding sorry at all. The police investigation, the questions about Mr. Miller's rapid promotion, the access to sensitive information. The board is unanimous. We need to minimize liability. The board met without me. Victoria's voice was dangerous. Emergency session. We tried calling you, but you weren't answering your phone. Sterling's tone suggested this was further evidence of poor judgment. Margaret Caldwell felt it was best to handle this quickly and quietly. George looked at Victoria, seeing her torn between protecting him and protecting the company she'd spent 20 years building. He made the decision for her. Ms. Ashworth, I'll resign, effective immediately. George, no, we'll fight this, we'll prove. Prove what? George stood up, his voice calm despite the fury building in his chest. That someone stole my access codes? That someone who knows this building well enough to avoid security cameras framed me perfectly? We both know who had the means and motive to do this. Sterling's expression didn't change, but George caught the slight tightening around his eyes. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Miller. I hope you have evidence to support it. The evidence is sitting right there, George said, pointing at the termination papers. Prepared and printed before the police even finished questioning me. You've been waiting for this opportunity since the day I was promoted. George, Victoria said quietly, don't make this worse. But George was past caring about making things worse. 3 months of swallowing condescension, of proving himself daily to people who would never see past his janitor's uniform, of watching Emma beam with pride about her father's success. It all crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. Mr. Sterling, you want to know what's really funny about this whole thing? In 8 years of cleaning these offices, I learned more about this company than you've learned in 15 years of managing it. I know which departments are bleeding money, which vendors are overcharging us, which executives expense personal meals as business dinners. I know because invisible people see everything. Sterling's face was stone. Are you threatening me, Mr. Miller? I'm explaining why you need me gone, not because I'm incompetent or corrupt, but because I know exactly how incompetent and corrupt this place really is, and that terrifies you. Victoria stood up abruptly. That's enough, both of you. But George wasn't finished. Ms. Ashworth, I want you to know that these 3 months working for you have been the best of my career, not because of the money or the title, but because you treated me like someone whose opinion mattered. You listened when I spoke, you trusted me with responsibility, And you never once made me feel like I had to apologize for who I was before you promoted me." Victoria's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "George, but I won't stay where I'm not wanted, and I won't let my presence here be used to hurt you or your company." George picked up the termination papers and signed them with deliberate care. "I'll clean out my office this afternoon." As George reached the door, Sterling called after him. "Mr. Miller? I hope you understand that any attempt to contact the media about your theories would constitute defamation. The legal team has been very clear about that." George turned back, his hand on the door handle. "Mr. Sterling, I've been poor my whole life. I've got nothing left to lose. But you? You've got a very comfortable lifestyle built on other people's work. Might want to remember that." That evening, Emma found her father sitting at their kitchen table, staring at a box of personal items from his office. His coffee had gone cold, and the apartment felt heavy with defeat. "Dad, what happened?" George looked up at his daughter, brilliant, hopeful, trusting, and felt the weight of explaining that the world wasn't fair, that doing the right thing didn't always protect you, that sometimes good people lost to bad people simply because the bad people had better lawyers. "I lost my job, sweetheart. Someone made it look like I stole information from the company. I didn't, but I can't prove that." Emma sat down across from him, her face serious. "It was that Sterling guy, wasn't it? The one you said was always undermining you?" George nodded, too tired to pretend everything would be okay. "What are we going to do?" George reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. "What we always do. We figure it out together. I'll find another job, maybe not as good as this one, but something honest. We'll be okay." But as Emma went to her room to do homework, George sat alone in their small kitchen, looking at the eviction notice that was still taped to their refrigerator. He'd thought the promotion would solve their problems, but instead it had given him a glimpse of a different life before snatching it away. What George didn't know was that Victoria was, at that very moment, sitting in her office reviewing security footage with a private investigator she'd hired that afternoon. The investigation would take time, but she was determined to prove George's innocence. What neither of them knew was that Emma Miller was in her bedroom, writing an email to Michael Harrison. If adults couldn't figure out how to fight for what mattered, maybe it was time for someone younger and less afraid to show them how it was done. Victoria hadn't slept in 3 days. She sat in her office at 2 a.m., surrounded by security footage, access logs, and financial records that her private investigator had compiled. The evidence was damning, but not in the way Sterling had intended. Every piece of information pointed to an elaborate frame job, but proving it would require Victoria to make a choice that would fundamentally change everything about her carefully constructed world. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Ashworth, this is Emma Miller. I need to meet with you. It's about my dad, but also about something bigger. Tomorrow, 7 a.m., Pike Place Market, the flower vendor where you bought tulips yesterday. Come alone." Victoria stared at the message, her blood running cold. How did Emma know about the tulips? How did she even have Victoria's personal number? More importantly, what was a 15-year-old girl planning that required a clandestine meeting at dawn? The next morning, Victoria found Emma waiting beside a flower cart, her school backpack slung over one shoulder and a manila folder clutched in her hands. The girl looked older than her 15 years, her expression carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much and decided to act on it. "Thank you for coming," Emma said without preamble. "I wasn't sure you would." "Emma, if this is about your father's situation, I want you to know I'm doing everything I can to—" "It's not just about Dad," Emma interrupted. "It's about you and Michael Harrison and the fact that sometimes adults make things way more complicated than they need to be." Victoria's composure cracked. "How do you know about Michael?" Emma opened her folder and pulled out a photograph, the same photo that Victoria kept on her desk, face down during meetings. "He gave me this, along with some other things I think you need to see." Victoria's hands trembled as she took the photo. It showed her and Michael at 25, laughing beside the Pike Place Market sign, young and hopeful and completely unaware of the choices that would tear them apart. "He's been carrying this in his wallet for 20 years, Emma said gently. "Just like you've been carrying that ring around your neck. He told me about the letter, about why he reached out now, about how watching my dad return that ring made him realize that some things are too important to stay buried." "Emma, this is very complicated. You don't understand. I understand that my dad got fired because he's honest and that scares people. I understand that you've been miserable for 20 years because you thought you had to choose between love and success. And I understand that Michael Harrison has been building other people's dreams because he was too proud to chase his own. Emma's voice was firm, surprisingly adult. What I don't understand is why none of you are fighting for what actually matters. Victoria looked around the bustling market, remembering the girl she used to be, the one who would buy flowers with her last $5 because beauty was necessary, not optional. What do you want from me, Emma? I want you to stop being afraid. Emma pulled out another document from her folder. Michael isn't just a construction worker anymore. He started his own company 5 years ago. Harrison Construction specializes in affordable housing projects, community centers, schools. He's been building the kind of things you used to dream about when you were young and idealistic. Victoria stared at the business documentation Emma had somehow acquired. Michael's company was small but successful, with contracts throughout the Pacific Northwest for projects that prioritized community impact over maximum profit. How did you get all this? I asked him to coffee and told him to bring proof that he'd grown up in 20 years, that if he wanted to reach out to you, he better be someone worth reaching for. Emma's smile was proud and slightly mischievous. He passed the test. Emma, even if Michael and even if we figured out how to move forward, that doesn't help your father. Sterling has the board convinced that George is a security risk. Actually, it does help, Dad, because Michael Harrison Construction has been subcontracted on 3 major Meridian projects in the last 2 years. And Michael's been keeping very detailed records of cost overruns, timeline delays, and quality issues caused by the primary contractors that Sterling approved. Victoria's eyes widened. What kind of records? Emma pulled out a thick stack of documentation, the kind that shows Sterling's been approving contracts with companies that charge premium rates for substandard work. The kind that show he's been taking kickbacks and covering up safety violations. The kind that proved Dad wasn't the security risk, Sterling was. Victoria flipped through the documents, her business mind immediately recognizing the implications. This is millions in fraudulent billing. And these safety violations could have resulted in serious injuries. Michael's been trying to figure out how to report this without destroying his own company's relationships. But when he learned what happened to Dad, he realized some things are more important than protecting yourself. Why are you showing me this instead of taking it to the police? Emma looked at Victoria with eyes that seemed far too wise for a teenager. Because the police already decided Dad was guilty. Because Sterling has lawyers and connections and the presumption of innocence. Because sometimes the system only works if people with power choose to make it work. Victoria sat down heavily on a nearby bench, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Using this information would destroy Sterling, but it would also expose Michael's involvement, potentially damaging his business. It would mean admitting that her judgment in promoting George had been right, but also that her oversight of Sterling had been catastrophically wrong. Emma, if I act on this information, there will be consequences. For Michael's business, for the company, for everyone involved. There are already consequences, Emma said quietly. My dad is unemployed and being investigated for a crime he didn't commit. You're miserable and alone because you think success means never being vulnerable. Michael's been spending 20 years building other people's dreams because he thought he'd lost the right to his own. And Sterling's still out there stealing money and putting people at risk because no one's been brave enough to stop him. Victoria looked at this remarkable teenager who had somehow orchestrated a meeting that could change everything. What makes you think any of this will work out the way you hope? Because, Emma said, I've been watching my dad my whole life. He taught me that doing the right thing isn't about guaranteed outcomes. It's about choosing who you want to be when everything goes wrong. And right now, you get to choose who you want to be. Victoria stood up, the documents clutched in her hands, feeling more terrified and more hopeful than she had in 20 years. Emma, what you've done here, it's extraordinary. But why? Why go to all this trouble for people you barely know? Emma smiled, and for a moment, she looked exactly like her father. Because my dad spent 8 years being invisible so that people like you could have clean offices and working elevators. Because he found something precious and returned it because that's who he is. Because sometimes, when the adults are too scared to fight for what's right, someone has to show them how it's done. That afternoon, Victoria sat in her office with the door locked, staring at two phone numbers written on separate pieces of paper. One was for Detective Chen, who could reopen George's case with the new evidence. The other was for Michael Harrison, the man whose heart she'd broken 20 years ago and whose integrity might just save the company she'd built on the ruins of their love. The choice wasn't between her past and her future anymore. It was between the woman she'd become and the woman she'd always been meant to be. And for the first time in 20 years, Victoria Ashworth knew exactly which choice her 25-year-old self would have made. She picked up the phone and dialed Michael's number first. The call lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. Victoria sat in her office, phone pressed to her ear, listening to Michael Harrison's voice for the first time in 20 years. It was deeper now, weathered by time and experience, but still carried the same warmth that had once made her feel like anything was possible. "Victoria," he said simply when he answered, as if he'd been expecting her call for 2 decades. "Michael," her voice broke slightly on his name, "I got your letter." "And?" "And our timing has always been terrible," Victoria laughed despite herself, a sound caught between joy and desperation. "I need your help with something that could destroy both our careers. But first, I need to ask you something. Anything. Do you still believe that love is more important than success?" Michael was quiet for a long moment. "I believe that success without love is just expensive emptiness. And I believe that love without the courage to build something together is just beautiful failure." Victoria closed her eyes, feeling 20 years of careful control dissolving. "I'm scared, Michael. I'm scared that I've become someone you can't love. I'm scared that I've forgotten how to be the person who deserves to be loved." "Victoria," Michael's voice was gentle but firm, "I didn't fall in love with your potential 20 years ago. I fell in love with your heart. And from what Emma Miller told me about how you've treated her father, that heart is still there. Maybe buried under 2 decades of business suits and board meetings, but still there." "You've been talking to Emma?" "She's remarkable. Reminds me of someone I used to know. Brilliant, determined, completely fearless when it comes to fighting for what's right." Michael paused. "She also told me about the evidence we have against Sterling, about what we could do to help her father." Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, the same feeling she'd had at 25 when she decided to apply to business school despite everyone telling her it was impossible. "Michael, if we do this, if we use your documentation to expose Sterling, it could backfire on both of us. Your company could lose contracts. Meridian could face lawsuits. The board could force me out. And if we don't do it, a good man stays destroyed, a corrupt executive continues stealing and endangering lives, and we both go back to being too afraid to fight for what matters. Then it sounds like we don't really have a choice." Victoria smiled, feeling more like herself than she had in years. "Meet me at Meridian Tower in 1 hour. We're going to Detective Chen first, then the board, together." "Victoria?" "Yes?" "I love you. I never stopped loving you. And whatever happens next, I need you to know that helping George Miller isn't about winning you back. It's about becoming the man who deserves a second chance with the woman who taught me what courage looks like." An hour later, Victoria and Michael sat in Detective Chen's office, watching the detective's expression change as she reviewed the Harrison construction documentation. Michael had brought everything: detailed records of safety violations, photographs of substandard work, financial records showing the elaborate kickback scheme Sterling had orchestrated. "This is extensive," Detective Chen said slowly, "and, if it's accurate, it completely changes the context of the break-in at Meridian Tower. Someone wasn't trying to steal information. They were trying to plant evidence to frame Mr. Miller before this documentation could surface." "That's our theory," Victoria said. "Richard Sterling knew Michael's company had this information. Framing George was meant to discredit any accusations by making it look like a disgruntled employee was trying to cause trouble." Detective Chen looked up from the files. "Ms. Ashworth, you understand that pursuing this investigation will likely result in criminal charges against your Vice President of Operations? The financial fraud alone could be federal charges." "I understand. What I want to know is whether this is enough to clear George Miller completely." "More than enough. We'll have Mr. Miller's charges dropped by end of day. But I need to ask, why are you doing this? Sterling's crimes don't directly hurt you. You could have quietly fired him and moved on." Victoria looked at Michael, then back at Detective Chen. Because 20 years ago I learned that you can build an empire on compromise and still end up with nothing that matters. And 3 months ago, George Miller reminded me that some people choose integrity even when it costs them everything. I want to be that kind of person again. 2 hours later, Victoria stood before an emergency board meeting in Meridian's main conference room. The same executives who had rushed to fire George without her input now sat around the mahogany table, looking uncomfortable as she presented Detective Chen's preliminary findings about Sterling's criminal activity. "This is impossible," Margaret Caldwell said, her usual composure shaken. "Richard's been with the company for 15 years. His record is impeccable." "His record," Victoria said calmly, "shows exactly what he wanted us to see. The reality is that we've been hemorrhaging money for years due to fraudulent contracts he approved, and it's a miracle no one was seriously injured due to the safety violations he covered up." "Even if this is all true," said David Chen from Human Resources, "the damage to the company's reputation could be catastrophic. Maybe we should handle this quietly, internally." Victoria had expected this response. The instinct to protect the company's image at all costs, to sweep problems under expensive rugs and hope they never surfaced. It was exactly how she would have handled this situation a year ago. "No," she said simply, "we're going to do this right. We're going to cooperate fully with law enforcement. We're going to make reparations to every client who was overcharged. And we're going to implement oversight procedures to ensure this never happens again." "Victoria," Margaret Caldwell's voice was carefully controlled, "I think you're letting personal feelings cloud your business judgment. This situation with the janitor, facilities manager," Victoria corrected sharply, "and George Miller's situation isn't personal, it's about justice. About admitting when we've made mistakes and taking responsibility for fixing them. The board could vote to remove you as CEO if we feel you're acting against the company's interests," David Chen said quietly. Victoria nodded. "You could, and you might be doing me a favor. Because I've been asking myself lately what the point of running a company is if I have to compromise everything I believe in to keep it." The room fell silent. These executives had never heard their ice-cold CEO speak about beliefs or principles. They were used to discussions about market share and profit margins, not questions about what kind of person someone wanted to be. "However," Victoria continued, "before you make that decision, you should know that I've been in contact with Harrison Construction, the company that documented Sterling's fraud. They've agreed to partner with Meridian on a new initiative, affordable housing development throughout the Pacific Northwest. Low-income housing, community centers, schools. Projects that might not maximize short-term profits, but will create long-term value and positive community impact." Margaret Caldwell frowned. "Since when are we in the housing development business?" "Since I remembered that businesses are supposed to serve communities, not just shareholders. Since I realized that success without purpose is just expensive emptiness." Victoria looked around the table at faces that reflected 20 years of careful corporate thinking, of decisions made in boardrooms by people who would never be affected by the consequences. For the first time in her career, she didn't care whether they approved. "Gentlemen, ladies, here's what's going to happen. We're going to clear George Miller's name publicly and offer him his position back with a formal apology. We're going to cooperate fully with law enforcement regarding Sterling's crimes. We're going to launch the Affordable Housing Initiative. And we're going to do it because it's the right thing to do, not because it polls well with focus groups." "And if the board votes against this direction?" Margaret asked. Victoria smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Then you'll be looking for a new CEO, but I think you'll find that doing the right thing is actually good business." Radical concept, I know. As the board members filed out to deliberate, Victoria sat alone in the conference room where she'd made 1,000 decisions based on fear and calculation. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Seattle stretched toward the horizon, full of people like George Miller who went to work every day and tried to do right by their families. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Dad's been stress cleaning the apartment all morning. When should I tell him to put on his good shirt?" Victoria smiled and typed back, "Tell him to put it on now. He's going to need it for the press conference where we announce his promotion to Director of Facilities and Community Development." For the first time in 20 years, Victoria Ashworth was about to do something that had nothing to do with profit margins and everything to do with the kind of person she wanted to be when she looked in the mirror. 6 months later, George Miller stood in the community center that Meridian Enterprises and Harrison Construction had just completed in South Seattle. The building was beautiful in its simplicity. Clean lines, lots of natural light, spaces designed for children to learn and families to gather. It was also the first project George had overseen in his new role as Director of Facilities and Community Development, a position that combined everything he'd learned about buildings with everything he believed about helping people. "Dad, look at this!" Emma called from across the main hall, where she was helping set up for the opening ceremony. At 16, she'd grown taller and more confident, but she still had the same bright smile that had carried them through their darkest days. "They put your name on the dedication plaque, right next to Ms. Ashworth's and Mr. Harrison's." George walked over to read the brass plaque mounted near the entrance. The Miller Family Community Center, dedicated to the belief that everyone deserves a place to grow, learn, and belong. Made possible through the partnership of Meridian Enterprises and Harrison Construction, and the vision of those who understand that true success is measured by the lives we touch. "The Miller Family Community Center?" George repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought it was just the South Seattle Community Center." "Surprise!" came a familiar voice behind him. Victoria Ashworth approached wearing jeans and a simple blue sweater, a far cry from the business suits that had once been her armor. She looked younger somehow, her face softer, her smile genuine. The board voted unanimously. "After everything you've done for the company and the community, we thought it was appropriate." Beside her walked Michael Harrison, his hand intertwined with hers in a gesture so natural it seemed like they'd never been apart. He wore work boots and a flannel shirt, his face bearing the tan lines of someone who spent his days building things rather than sitting in boardrooms. "George," Michael said, extending his hand, "I've been wanting to thank you properly. If you hadn't found that ring, if you hadn't shown Victoria what integrity looks like in practice, none of this would have happened." George shook Michael's hand, marveling at how different the world looked now than it had a year ago. "I think you're giving me too much credit. I just did what felt right." "Exactly," Victoria said. "That's what made all the difference." The opening ceremony was everything George had hoped it would be. Families from the neighborhood filled the space, children ran laughing through the halls, and teenagers gathered around the art therapy studio that Emma had helped design. The community center included a job training facility, a child care center, a small medical clinic, and spaces for everything from computer classes to support groups. As George watched a group of kids exploring the new playground outside, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Detective Chen had arrived for the ceremony, looking pleased as she surveyed the building. "George, I wanted you to know that Richard Sterling was sentenced yesterday. 5 years for fraud, 2 years for endangering public safety. He'll serve them concurrently, but he'll be disbarred from any corporate positions when he gets out." George nodded. "How's he taking it?" "About as well as you'd expect from someone who thought he was too important to face consequences." But the evidence was overwhelming. Michael Harrison's documentation was incredibly thorough. "Any word on the other executives who were involved?" 2 plea deals, 1 resignation, and 1 full cooperation agreement. The company's oversight procedures have been completely restructured. From what I hear, Victoria Ashworth doesn't tolerate even the appearance of impropriety anymore. George looked across the room to where Victoria was kneeling beside a group of children, helping them plant seeds in the community garden area. She caught his eye and waved, dirt smudged on her cheek, looking happier than he'd ever seen her. Later that evening, after the ceremony had ended and the last of the neighbors had gone home, George, Emma, Victoria, and Michael sat together in the center's main hall sharing pizza and reflecting on the journey that had brought them all together. "You know what's funny?" Emma said, twirling cheese around her finger. "A year ago, I was worried about Dad losing his job as a janitor. Now he's a director. Ms. Ashworth is engaged to her high school sweetheart, and I'm going to be the first Miller to go to college on a full scholarship." "What's funny about that?" Victoria asked, smiling. "It all started because Dad found a ring and gave it back instead of keeping it. One honest decision changed everyone's entire life." George looked at his daughter with pride. Emma had indeed received a full scholarship to the University of Washington, where she planned to study art therapy and community development. But more than that, she'd grown into a young woman who understood that courage meant fighting for other people, not just herself. "Actually," George said, "I think it changed our lives because we all decided to stop being afraid of who we really were. The ring was just the beginning." Michael raised his coffee cup in a toast. "To second chances and the people brave enough to take them." To integrity, Victoria added, and learning that doing the right thing is always worth the risk. To family, Emma said, the one you're born with and the one you choose. George looked around the circle, at his remarkable daughter, at the woman who had seen his potential when others saw only limitations, at the man who had proven that love and ambition could coexist if both people were willing to grow. They were an unlikely family, brought together by chance and held together by choice. As they finished cleaning up and prepared to leave, Victoria pulled George aside. "George, there's something I need to tell you. The board has asked me to consider expanding the community development program nationwide. They want to replicate what we've done here in other cities." "That's incredible news. You must be thrilled." "I am, but I can't do it without the right team. Without someone who understands that buildings are just structures until people fill them with purpose." Victoria looked directly at him. "I want you to be my partner in this, George. Not my employee, my partner. Equal stake, equal say, equal responsibility." George felt his breath catch. "Victoria, I don't know what to say." "Say yes. Say you believe that a former janitor and a reformed corporate executive can change how business gets done in this country. Say you believe that success and integrity don't have to be mutually exclusive." George looked out the window at the neighborhood around them, families in modest apartments, small businesses struggling to survive, children who deserved every opportunity Emma had been given. Then he looked at Victoria, who had risked everything she'd built to do what was right. "Yes," he said simply, "I believe that completely." 3 months later, George stood in the lobby of the newly renovated Meridian building, watching as workers installed a new plaque by the entrance. It read, "Meridian Community Development, Building More Than Buildings." Below it, in smaller text, "Founded on the principle that true wealth is measured by the lives we improve and the communities we strengthen." Emma joined him, home from her first semester at college for winter break. She'd grown even more in just 3 months away, her confidence blooming in the university environment. "Dad, remember when you used to clean this lobby every night?" "Every night for 8 years, George confirmed. "Did you ever imagine you'd own half the company?" George laughed. "Never in my wildest dreams. But you know what's strange? I'm not sure I'm any happier now than I was then. Don't get me wrong. I love the work, I love the opportunities, I love being able to provide for you properly. But I think I was already rich. I just didn't know how to measure it." Emma hugged her father. "You taught me something important, Dad. You taught me that who you are is more important than what you have. That integrity is the only thing you can never lose unless you give it away." As they walked out of the building together, George thought about the ring that had started everything. Victoria wore it now on her left hand, beside the simple gold band that Michael had given her during their quiet wedding ceremony in Pike Place Market. The inscription still read, "Forever yours, M," but now it meant something different. Not a promise broken, but a promise kept across 20 years of growth and change. George Miller had spent his whole life believing that success was something that happened to other people. He'd never imagined that his greatest success would come not from what he achieved, but from who he chose to be when no one was watching. And in teaching that lesson to everyone around him, he'd discovered that sometimes the most valuable thing you can find isn't something you can hold in your hands. It's something you can hold in your heart. The man who had once returned a fortune because his daughter was always watching had built something far more valuable, a life where anyone would be proud to watch. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.